All right, so this is the first of our snippets for the week of the 22nd. So we're going to start with the election of 1848, where the Whigs nominate Zachary Taylor, who's a war hero from the Mexican War. And the Whigs, remember, are a party that's divided between North and South. Taylor is a Louisianan. He was a slaveholder, but he's perceived as someone who is also a strong unionist. He's anti-nullification, and he also had never voted before 1848. And so the sense was he could kind of appeal to both sides. And in some ways, the most interesting thing about the 1848 election is this new party called the Free Soil Party, which calls for the elimination of slavery in all of the territories. And they get Martin Van Buren, the former Democratic president, to run as their nominee in 1848. They don't win any states, but they win more than 10% of the vote. And that previews the emergence of a much more aggressive anti-slavery attitude, political anti-slavery attitude in the North. So here's the map from 1848. The Whigs carry the purple states. The Democrats carry the blue states. Remember that Van Buren gets 10%. So the anti-democratic coalition is around 57%. There's a real backlash against the effects of the Mexican War, and the hope is that Taylor will, return to a more moderate approach that might have occurred if Henry Clay had been elected in 1844. It might have been clear, though, even at the start of Taylor's presidency, and of course Taylor dies in office, that this was going to be problematic. One pattern from this period of American history, 1848 to 1860, is that it becomes increasingly difficult to organize either the House or the Senate because the parties themselves are internally divided, usually along regional lines. So Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs don't like each other, and Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats don't like each other. So even to elect a speaker of the House of Representatives in 1849 takes 63 ballots before finally Howell Cobb, a Democrat from Georgia, emerges. And this kind of very protracted vote for House and Senate officers will take place basically in every Congress between 1848 and 1860. It's another sign of the way in which slavery and positions on slavery is basically subsuming all aspects of American politics. And that happens in what is the big crisis of the Taylor presidency caused by the gold rush. This is a photograph of the gold rush to California, which brings thousands of people to California and has the unintended, California, of course, had been seized from Mexico in the Mexican War, has the unintended consequence suddenly of giving California a sufficient population to petition for admission to the Union as a state, which it does in 1850. And there are basically no slaves in California, so California petitions as a free state, which would have the effect of giving the free states more representation in the Senate. Remember, they already had more representation in the House. There's very strong Southern opposition to this. Taylor's position is California has enough people to come in. They don't want to have slaves in their state. That sounds good to me. I want them admitted. But Southerners balk. And Henry Clay, in what is his last major legislative act, champions a compromise of what comes to be known as the Compromise of 1850, that brings California in as a free state in exchange for a whole bunch of concessions to slaveholding interests. So slavery in D.C. remains legal. Texas gets funds to give up a small portion of relatively underpopulated land to Utah and these new territories, Utah and New Mexico. In Utah and New Mexico, a new concept is put in called popular sovereignty. The idea is that the residents of the territory themselves can decide whether or not slavery will be allowed. So this is basically the opposite of what the free soil people wanted. And the fugitive slave law is strengthened. This horrific law in American history that that required Northerners who encountered escaped slaves to return them to the South. Taylor opposes this, but Taylor then dies in office. He's replaced by a more accommodationist Whig, the Vice President Millard Fillmore, and the Compromise of 1850 is signed. For our purposes, the big element of the Compromise of 1850 is this concept of popular sovereignty. the idea of basically the federal government abandoning the position it had taken since the Northwest Ordinance of the Articles period, saying we're going to decide whether or not slavery will be allowed in the territory, and devolving that power to the residents of the territory, basically kicking the can down the road. So here's the map of the Compromise of 1850. We get California admitted as a free state. Utah and New Mexico are admitted under the popular sovereignty. And you'll notice that Texas loses some of its territory here in the far western part of the state. This debate, it's a contentious debate. For slave state senators, some of them say this doesn't go far enough. It triggers significant opposition, though, among some Northern Whigs who basically say Clay is making a deal with the devil here. And the most famous of the opponents here is a man named William Seward, who is a senator from New York, major player in New York Whig politics, who gives what's known as the higher law address, in which he basically argues that opposition to slavery needs to be a defining characteristic of people of principle in the United States. And the famous line is that there is a higher law than the Constitution, which regulates our authority over the domain and devotes it to the same noble purposes. The territory is a part, no inconsiderable part, of the common heritage of mankind bestowed upon them by the creator of the universe. Now, in the context that Seward was operating, it's hard to argue that he was wrong. And basically saying that the slavery was allowed by the Constitution, and there are moral tenets that supersede the Constitution that say a country should not allow one person to be enslaved by another. But this is a concept which is there's a slippery slope element on with regards to higher law, and Seward as the idea. All right, well, if you're saying that, what does that apply to tax policy? Does that apply to immigration policy? Does that apply to women's suffrage? And this speech marks Seward incorrectly in many ways as something of a radical among New York thinkers. It plays a key role in why Lincoln, rather than Seward, gets the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. The emergence of slavery politics and the polarization of slavery politics. So you have Seward on the one hand and some of these pro-Southern Whigs on the other, tears the Whig Party apart. In 1852, remember, the Whigs had done really, really well. They basically sweep the Electoral College. In the 1852 race, even though the Democrats nominated a pretty colorless candidate, Franklin Pierce, a Democratic official from New Hampshire. The Whigs are only able to carry 4 states, and the Whigs basically perish as a political party in the 4 years following 1852. So you have Pierce as a weak Democrat who is elected, but the dominant figure of the Pierce years, so Pierce is in office from 1853 to 1857, is this man, Stephen Douglas. Douglas was a Democratic senator from Illinois, a very ambitious man, someone who wanted to be president on the Democratic ticket. Like most Democrats and Republicans and Whigs from the Midwestern part of the country, Douglas was a racist even by the standards of his time. His rhetoric is littered with racist statements. But Douglas is also an Illinois senator, and as he looks at the country in the 1850s, his primary goal is empowering Illinois economically, making Chicago a center of American commerce. And as a result, he promotes the construction of a railroad between Chicago and the Pacific coast, San Francisco, as a way of opening up the Pacific to the Chicago trade. But to get that railroad, Douglas believes, not entirely incorrectly, that there needed to be more white settlers in the Kansas and Nebraska territories, this unorganized territory of the 1850s, to protect the railroad from Indian nations that were hostile to American interests in the region. So he's thinking in his own mind of how do we come up with a plan to encourage more white settlement in this area. And what he comes up with is this law called the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Now, under the Missouri Compromise, these territories, because they're north of the Missouri Compromise line, these territories had forbid slavery. Douglas changes the rules with Democratic support. The Democrats have control of both houses of Congress. It allows for the introduction of slavery in these territories, using the popular sovereignty concept that Clay had originated with regards to Utah and New Mexico. No one really believes that slavery is going to occur in the Nebraska territory, modern-day Nebraska, the Dakotas, part of Montana. But Kansas is another question. Southerners, slaveholders move from Missouri into Kansas, try to create a new slave state. This is a law which is incredibly polarizing and is very, very unpopular in the North. Northern Democrats, Whigs, members of this new Republican Party created in 1854 believe that Douglas has sacrificed the good of the country to Southern slaveholders, and the result is in the only truly four-party race in American history, the 1854 elections to the U.S. House of Representatives. There are two new parties. You can see the seat change. The parties that had 0 seats in 1852 and suddenly emerge in 1854. One is the Republican Party, whose organizing principle is free soil, free labor, free men. So free soil is we don't want slavery in the territories. Free labor is the idea of a capitalist system rather than a slaveholding system, and free men is an openness to the idea of abolition of slavery. The American Party, sometimes called the Know Nothing Party, is a nativist party, which argues, says, look, we see all of these problems, but the real problem in the United States is foreign immigration. We need to cut off immigration that will reunify the country. The Americans don't usually take much of a position one way or the other on slavery. The Democrats, you can see, get creamed in the 1854 election, and most of these seat losses are from the North. And the Whigs also suffer a loss, although not seemingly a fatal loss. So the result is that you have 4 parties in the House. The largest party has only 33%, and so it makes organizing the House extremely difficult in the aftermath of the conflict. So that's our first snippet, which takes us up to the mid 1850s.